Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta. I'm your host. And this is episode number 2, Retirement Thinking Without Stinking Thinking. A little bit more about that in a minute. Today I'll be talking about reviewing the good news from podcast 1 and reviewing why I'm doing this podcast/blog. And also, as my title implied, talking about stinking thinking, or stinking thinking as it's usually said in AA, and the second half of life. And if there's time after that, I'd promised I'd drop back in on legacy, another of the second half shifts, a little bit more depth on chasing rainbows, and perhaps revisit one of Carl Jung's quotes again. So I'll start today by reviewing each of those 3 points I said I was going to be talking about. And the good news is that the second half of life is a tremendous opportunity, not the dire prediction that most of our culture tells us is going to happen as we age. It's a golden time for making meaning and purpose, or renewing meaning and purpose, if we've lost them for any of the number of reasons why we could as we head into our elder years, and for living a life that's much more vital than anything people usually predict for us if they take the normal cultural line that this is bad news getting older. The reason that I'm doing this podcast/blog is that I want to help people to, one, know that vital elder years are available, and no matter if we have some problems, like some health problems, some relatively serious health problems even, or perhaps financial issues, or any of a number of things that can face us at any time in life, and especially as we grow older. I want people to know what they can do, what the possibilities are, and what will help them to take advantage of the opportunity for vitality in their elder years or their retirement years, and for renewing meaning and purpose. So if I go back to the addiction field, which I spent a good part of my career years in participating in as an addiction therapist, addicts have a particularly important task when they begin to take on treatment and recovery. Their very life is at stake. They may not know it, but they have a terminal illness. And unless they're able to see the reality of that and address it, it's first going to destroy the quality of their life and then take away their life itself. So they have a hugely important task. Unfortunately, it's very easy for them to develop what I've termed as stinking thinking, because that task, while it's important, seems counter to their own purposes. And so it is very easy for them to begin to think in ways that will enable them to continue to drink or drug, because their drug of choice has taken on the importance of it's the way that they are able to get through life. They believe that without it, they could not do life, although they might not be able to say it in those words. We have a particularly important task for those of us in or approaching the second half of life, because, as I mentioned in the first podcast, there are things we have to know as we move into the second half of life, because we're going to find out that what worked for us in the first half of life does not do so much anymore. And we're left fumbling and struggling somewhat and somewhat off center. And in order to have quality years, and whatever that might mean for different individuals, but certainly not that dire prediction that the culture predicts for us, then we too can become easily subject to stinking thinking, partly because of what the culture tells us we're going to experience, and partly because of a host of other things that we might have a chance to address in the second half if we know how to go about that. As I'll be elaborating on as we go through this talk, stinking thinking will have to be addressed. I mentioned some early similarities with addiction, and actually I, like probably most of the addiction treatment world, thought that stinking thinking was an AA or a 12-step program concept. But I found that it was actually first coined by Albert Ellis, the psychologist who developed rational emotive behavior therapy, and around the time of the late 1950s, about 1959 actually, I believe. And what stinking thinking is, it's persistence in a kind of thinking that really doesn't serve us well as far as moving ahead with our lives. We're growing, doing positive things. It's generally negative and pessimistic. It weakens desire for the good and brings the emphasis to what's safe and familiar, although not really. Stinking thinking for the addict might help him or her to feel safer, less vulnerable, less likely to have to give up their best friend, their drug of choice. But it will also keep them stuck in a situation that's only going to get worse. And as I said, will ultimately lead to death. Addiction is a terminal illness. For those of us in the second half of life or approaching the second half of life, stinking thinking can keep us from taking the risks or actions necessary to capitalize on the very great opportunities for enhanced living in the second half of life years, or what are roughly corresponding with our retirement years, or some pre-retirement years perhaps. Closely aligned with stinking thinking would be what I would term resistance. And the resistance is, in this case, often to our own well-being, because moving toward change, moving toward recovery, moving toward changing things up in the second half of life is unfamiliar. And we are generally wired for the familiar. We feel better when we're on what appears to be solid, safe, familiar ground. So we can't take a positive forward step beginning with a negative. If we start from a negative place, it's going to be nearly impossible to get to a positive place because the negative is going to short circuit what has to happen. It's going to keep us in that familiar but not so healthy ground. It could also be what I refer to as sort of the foot on the brake syndrome. It's as if we want to go forward, we want to go somewhere, but we're in an automobile, someone else is driving perhaps, but we have our foot firmly on the brake. And so the vehicle wants to go forward, wants to take us somewhere, but we're keeping it from happening by pressing so hard on the brake. And that is what resistance and stinking thinking can do. It's like trying to move ourselves forward with a brake firmly applied, and it's not going to work. So I want to take some time now to tell you a little about the classic push-pull sort of dilemma that we human beings seem to have to deal with when we want to make a significant change. We might want to change. We might realize at least that we need to make a significant change. But as soon as we get into that realm, it somehow triggers in us that we're getting out of safe, familiar, invulnerable territory. And so we begin to think about what the cost of that change is going to be, which is that we're going to have to feel anxious and somewhat uncomfortable for a period of time as we go into the unfamiliar territory. Unfortunately, what happens in many situations is that we decide to go back. We decide to go back to what's familiar and seems safe, even though there are aspects of it that we know are not good for us or that we ourselves are unhappy with. If you've been around any growth or self-realization or human realization kind of endeavors, you've probably seen some form of a poster that says in one way or another, there's no growth without risk, or at least a perceived sense of risk. Most of us prefer not to be uncomfortable for sometimes any reason, and yet that's one of the costs of changing for the better, changing for a change we would like to make, is that we're going to have to tolerate some uncomfortable, perhaps unfamiliar feelings. I don't know if you remember my speaking in my first podcast or if you've read anything on my website, that my podcast and my blog are not just about information. Information is good and helpful, but I haven't noticed that information alone produces much transformation or true change. So one of the reasons I started my podcast and my blog is I want to help the people who are interested in doing so to not just gather a lot of information, but to have it be transformative for them, transformational in some way that's important to them. So when we start talking about transformation, then we're adding a new level of angst, because what can happen is transformation does not produce just like a bigger, better person or entity before they went through the process of change. It produces someone who's significantly new, at least in some special way. I remember still when I was in my training, postgraduate training at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, I was excited about it. And I came back and told my wife after one of our weekend experiences at the Gestalt Institute that I'm changing. I'm becoming a different person. And she right away said, "But I like the person you are already." And looking back, I couldn't blame her for that. But we too can then become afraid that, if I change, if I'm truly transformed, who will I be? And will I like the person that I am? And perhaps even more importantly, will others like the person that I am? So it adds a new level of stimulus for stinking thinking to pull us back into a safer mode. Hey, let me take a moment to give you an example of transformation. When a caterpillar goes into a cocoon and spends a certain amount of time there, and ultimately comes out as a beautiful butterfly, it's not just a bigger, better version of the caterpillar. It's now a new being. It is truly transformed. It has beautiful wings. It can fly. It can visit all sorts of beautiful flowers. It becomes a pollinator. Rather than chewing up and destroying things, it helps us to grow things. It helps plants to flourish. And when the caterpillar went into that cocoon, it could have had reservations. What's going to happen to me while I'm in there? I'm not going to be in charge. So this is just some of the anxiety that can be generated in us that makes us want to hold back. Wait a minute, maybe this is not such a good idea. Thinking back for a second, I'm realizing that with all the talk about stinking thinking and resistance and positives and negatives and foot on the brake and holding back, you might be ready to go, what's this all about? So I'll start with the positive negative thing first. A person, in the situation that you're in, or that if we were in the going back to drug and alcohol work again, who is faced with active addiction, possibly the need for recovery. For them, or for someone who's just anxious about the future and what might be happening that they don't know about and aren't really prepared for yet, to them, stinking thinking is a positive because it keeps them safe in a place where they're not vulnerable. And someone who is experiencing resistance also feels that when they feel the resistance and they hold back, they're keeping themselves in a less vulnerable place. So for them, that's a positive. But if you're thinking about a happy, fulfilling retirement or elder years or second half of life, it's a negative, because to move into that new area, you're going to need to experience some resistance, some edginess, some anxiety. You're going to have to engage with whatever it is that you need to engage with. So that becomes a positive then, because I said earlier, there's no growth without risk. When we're moving into any kind of change, we're going to feel some degree of discomfort. And probably the bigger the change or the less we know about the area we're moving into, the more risk we're going to feel, the more discomfort we're going to feel. Actually, one of the most important aspects of our later years, our retirement years, of the big change and the movement into the unknown that is for us, is to engage with life, is to engage with the riskiness, with the discomfort, with the newness, with the prospect of good things, of growth and things that we're really going to like. But in order to get there, we have to engage. And resistance and stinking thinking are ways of disengaging or staying unengaged, because they keep us where we are. They keep us where we feel safer. And if we allow our resistance or stinking thinking to keep us in that safe or seemingly safe place all the time, then we'll find ourselves, especially as we're getting older, gradually or not so gradually disengaged from life. And then there's no staying still. There's no just remaining in one spot. We're going to be going backwards rather than staying still, and certainly not going forwards. And then we will simply be less and less happy, even though we might be feeling, well, at least I didn't have to take a big risk. And we are wired for safety, kind of your neural makeup. So it's not unusual behavior for us, but we have to kind of step out of the usual behavior and go into the unusual of risk-taking, of feeling the edge, that kind of growth-oriented but scary, new and unknown ground. But it's not just about discomfort. It's sort of like a gold miner who may be digging through a tunnel and it could collapse and it's dark and he's not really that sure where he's going, and that part doesn't feel good. But on the other hand, when he breaks through a wall and there's the gold, that feels very good. So we have to keep in mind sometimes, to keep us going, what we're pursuing, what we're hoping to have, what the good things are that we want to get by tolerating the discomfort, by feeling that edge in the uncertainty. Before moving on to talk about what are going to be some of the determinants of our success in living a vital second half of life, or with any other major change we might consider making, I want to take a sort of non-commercial, commercial break to let you know some things you might not know if you haven't been on my blog, or if this is the first podcast you're listening to, which is the second podcast overall. If you go to my website, retirementwithmeaning.com, you'll have an opportunity to request my small ebook, Overview for Resolving Your Retirement-Related Issues. It's about 17 pages, and I tried to make it a sort of a map and an overview, as it says, to let you know some of what the key items are in negotiating your way through retirement, early retirement, pre-retirement, and having an idea of what's going to help you with whatever your issue is, whether it's anxiety, how you fill your time, your fear of loneliness, all of the unknowns that we experience when we're making a big, big change from our career years, a lifetime of work, and now into a totally different sphere for us. And the ebook concentrates on particularly second half of life principles that are absolutely important, necessary to know and to use, because our first half mode won't work in the second half of life. That's what makes it so frustrating for people. They keep trying to do the first half over again, and it's not working anymore. So I think those 17 pages are well worth a quick read, and you may feel a little, you may not feel like a veteran at doing retirement years yet, but at least you'll be starting to get on the field a little bit and get into the action and engage with a little knowledge you didn't have before, but important knowledge. So go to the website, retirementwithmeaning.com, and at the top, if not every page, nearly every page, there is a button to request the ebook, and you'll get it just about immediately. And it's free. You can also ask to be informed when the next, the latest podcast is coming out. So that can be of use to you. I'd also like to thank my nephew, Mike Aceta, who, except for his tremendous facility with things technological, which I lack, I probably would not be sitting here speaking to you because I wouldn't have gotten this whole thing underway. Especially on some of the technology problems I ran into recently, Mike was a godsend. Between he and my daughter Julie, they usually manage to pull me through the technological challenges that I have. So with their help, I hope to be able to offer podcast 3, podcast 4, podcast 5, etc., with the hope that people are going to get some real benefit from them. So I encourage you to keep on listening, check the website, and if you find yourself being interested, then good things can happen. Okay, back to some of the determinants of success, and you might be thinking already that one of them is going to be how well we manage our resistance, how well we manage this thinking that is very easy for us to develop. Another key factor is support. The main thing that gets us past stinking thinking, resistance, either our own internal resistance or the resistance or stinking thinking we can develop from internalizing the messages from our culture or from people or situations that are not really healthy for us. The big part of the solution is to have the necessary support. Support that is helpful is, first of all, support that we learn to develop in ourselves. Right up there with that is support from people, from friends, family, who favor our success, who favor our well-being, who are not envious or jealous or made uncomfortable by the fact that we are active in trying to live a vital life. Support from people who know us well is very valuable. People who know our longing, our dreams, our disappointments in life, that we've shared on an intimate level with them, and they want to help us to go in the direction where we're trying to go, whether it's something new or whether it's healing from the past. People who are not supportive, as you might guess, would be when you say you want to do some certain thing or you're getting involved in something to improve your second half of life, or if an addict says they're into recovery, you don't want the person who says, well, what do you want to do that for? Or that sounds stupid. And there's the person who doesn't really hear you and just kind of brushes you off like, oh, it's just a midlife crisis. You'll get over it. Actually, they could be helping you in a way when they mention the midlife crisis, because a midlife crisis can be a very valuable trigger to get us thinking along lines that we need to consider that will be helpful for our overall growth and well-being. It might help to cut out the buying the motorcycle part or losing 70 pounds and living in the gym, although those in themselves are certainly not bad, and lots of people enjoy riding motorcycles and also live a vital life in other ways. But if it's a substitute for work that we have to be doing on ourselves, then that's a different matter. So let me try to summarize for you this first part of my podcast today on stinking thinking and what its effects can be if we're not careful. So there's a great potential reward in the second half of life, in enhanced vitality, in renewed meaning, renewed purpose, chances to heal, chances to grow, chances to develop in ourselves parts that were less developed or not really developed because of whatever, lack of opportunity, spending all the time we did on career, raising family, and so forth. So our circumstances change in good ways in the second half of life and can provide opportunities for us that we had not had up until then or did not take advantage of them. But I believe the reality is that we're going to have to deal with resistance. It's a rare time that we don't experience it. And we will have to manage our thinking. And we will have to develop and use supports. And we might even need to become willing to be transformed. When I was in my training at the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland, they used to talk about our growing edge. And the saying was that when we're on our growing edge, we grow edgy. And in parentheses, then we have to be able to tolerate that edginess, which can be part anxiety, part fear, part a lot of things. because of the unfamiliarity or the sense of, being more vulnerable than we really want to feel like being. So I want to emphasize, this is not Lone Ranger, rugged individualist work. It will have a much better chance of happening for you if you have and use the necessary support along the way. And then in many respects, the sky's the limit. Even though you do not have perhaps all the health you would like to have, or all the money, or all this or that, at that time of your life. So with that said, I would like to tell you some additional important thoughts here. There are some misconceptions I don't want to accidentally generate. So I want to make clear that the second half of life work is not a one-size-fits-all kind of endeavor. And I don't especially want to convey that there are some certain standards to attain, that you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this in order to be rated as someone who has really done outstanding change work in their second half of life and is living just a wonderful second half of life because they've met these certain standards. Not that at all. I realize, and I'm sure you do too, that terms don't mean the same thing to everyone. Someone else's vitality might be my boredom. Someone else's meaning might be way less than what that same thing that they're involved in would, the amount of meaning it would give to me. So that you're welcome to engage with this work at any level that fits you. And it can be a comfortable level, especially initially. Eventually it would have to move to where there's enough comfort that you feel okay with working on the change you might want to make, and enough discomfort or edginess that there's an opportunity to grow. If you're too safe, you can't grow. If you're too scared, you're not going to make the effort to. You'll back up and go back to safe territory. And I have seen, and I hope you have too, where even small changes have produced big results in an individual's life. It's like a small course correction of what seems like 1 degree at this point, but miles and miles later, it's many degrees. It's opened up a much wider path. One of the maybe not so small changes, but certainly could be along a continuum of overcoming long-standing perceived or self-imposed limitations. I think that would qualify for some level of success that might seem on the small side initially, but actually turns out to be very big. Something I think of when I make that statement to you is years ago when I was doing a lot of ropes course or adventure-based counseling work. I remember a woman who the task or the element that she was on was actually consisted of 2 utility poles standing vertically in the ground as a normal way a utility pole would, but lashed to them across maybe 30 feet high and across the length of a long utility pole, about 30 feet above the ground. And the task was to climb up the first pole, walk across, climb up the perpendicular vertical pole, and then walk across the pole that was horizontal to the ground, and then come back down. Actually, there was a way to come back down that was not sort of standard. And for many people, if they had issues with height, it was certainly high enough to get them on their growing edge, to get them edgy. And for many people, it was a big accomplishment to just get up the few steps on a stepladder, which took you to the prongs that stuck out where you could do some more serious climbing. And I think I forgot to mention that you were belayed. There was a rope attached to you, so if you fell off, someone down on the ground could stop your fall and lower you gently to the ground. But this woman was petrified. I'd rarely seen someone as scared as she was, and she was somewhat overweight, which was making the ascent more difficult for her than someone who was a little more agile maybe. But she did make it up the first pole and stood there, hanging onto that pole, unwilling to take the first step toward the next one. So over quite a period of time, she cried and shook and went through all sorts of emotions and physical phenomena but eventually she made her way all the way across to the other side. And I think it was a different woman who ended up on the other side. She was like going up the pole. She might have been Laura in The Glass Menagerie. And when she got across to the other pole, she was Wonder Woman. She was singing and crying and shouting. And eventually, when she allowed herself to be brought down to the ground, she briefly told us her story. And one, as you might imagine, was a story of someone who had always been told, you're going to get hurt, you can't learn to ride a bike, you're too clumsy, don't try this, you don't have what it takes. And so her whole life had been pre-cramped for her, a very narrow, constricted sort of existence. And she came out on that pole. She threw off all the various negative stories she'd been told about herself, and she overcame what had restricted her all her life, and I would say was a different person in significant respect when she got to the end of that event. And to me, that might have been a small thing in time, but I'm sure that was going to impact her positively for the rest of her life. So it's looking like we're not going to have time for some of the other things I had hoped to get in today, but I think I will take time to offer you an assignment that if you choose to take it up, you may. If you decide not to, it will self-destruct in 15 seconds. So here is a little assignment I would give you if you're finding yourself a little interested or intrigued or thinking, well, maybe. I'll give it at least another podcast or a look at the website. I'd like you to spend some time just throughout your day where you could sit down and sort of quietly meditate on it. So as you're exposed to some of the material on my website or on the podcast or on the blog, or you're exposed to other growing type of offering you possibilities for personal growth in some way or something that appeals to you that you want to do or change, pay attention to what the draw is, how you're feeling drawn, what you're feeling drawn to, and also what resistance you're feeling, or what stinking thinking wants to come into your head to slow you down and stop you, or what voices do you get from your environment, whether they are from friends, acquaintances, authority figures, whatever. And begin to get a feel for what it might take for you to pick something that you would like to grow in, you would like to change, you would like to make better in your life, you would like to have to offer. And even though you might not have started on some concrete thing, be aware of what sort of voices, positive voices, are calling to you that are offering you the opportunity to become better for yourself or happier or whatever it is that you're pursuing, or even perhaps transformed in some significant way. Well, our time is up, and I want to thank you for listening, especially if you made it all the way through the podcast. I hope you're feeling some stirring, something that feels kind of good to you, something that seems has your interest, making something that wasn't stirring now come alive a little bit, or at least feeling, I'm going to give this a try, or I'm going to try some other experience, but there's something here for me, and I want to pay attention, find out what it is, and find out what I'll have to do, perhaps to deal with any resistance or stinking thinking that wants to come up in me. And so I offer the resources of my blog, of my website, and of the podcast, and of myself. There's a place on the website to ask questions. You can ask me to cover a certain topic you would like to have covered. You can make a general comment, or you could pick a topic from a list of suggested topics I have posted, and you can do all that on the contact form that it's at the bottom of most of the pages. So once again, thanks for listening. I really appreciate your giving me this time, and I hope you will be listening in when Podcast 3 comes online.